Yeah. I have the privilege of introducing Nell Cerar this morning for today's forum, and Nell is with Lutheran Social Services Together for Youth, the recipient of February's Woven Basket. I think as of today, I am officially part of the forum committee because I'm introducing Nell, so that's how that works. So Together for Youth offers a safe and welcoming space where lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, two-spirit, and allied youth can connect with their peers, find resources, explore issues, and navigate challenges. I volunteered to introduce Nell this morning because it's an organization that has meant a lot to my family. A few years ago, Kathy Herms, also with Together for Youth at the time, visited UUCD. Kathy has very recently moved on to another wonderful organization called the Harm Reduction Sisters. Maybe they'll visit us someday. So some of those gathered may have been here for that. Today, Nell, who has stepped into Kathy's shoes, and soon they will be called Nell's shoes, will help us expand our understanding of gender expression, gender identity, and the current needs of LGBTQ+ youth. And she will include a respecting pronouns refresher. I want to just emphasize that we have got pronoun stickers out at the visitors table. Not everybody may have come across them because not everybody's visitors. My friend Louise Levy was the one who told me about the pronoun stickers, so I put one on my name tag here, and you'll be learning more this morning about why that's important. So we'll have a refresher. Here they come, and there's lots more at the visitor table. So take it away.
All right. Excuse me. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction here. As you said, my name is Nell Cerar. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the Together for Youth Outreach Program. And I'm here to talk to you today about some ideas around gender, identity, pronouns, and support, all in the spirit of LGBTQ+ youth, especially with a bit of a focus on trans individuals today. So let's get started.
Excuse me, we can't hear back here. Could you use the mic, please?
No, mic's not working.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So sorry.
We need a new,
Move up to the
yeah,
front.
we need a new partner.
Should we move this up here a little bit more? Would that be helpful to move the podium up a little bit?
There's not so much more I can do.
We have seats in the front row.
We do.
Lots of
And
them.
in the
It
second
is
row.
church, but you can sit up here.
I can project as well, try and really talk loud.
I do, may I sit in front of you? Yes.
All right, so to start, we're going to go over just again a brief refresher on pronouns, how to use them properly, just some basic etiquette stuff. Just you guys already have a pretty good understanding of it by the looks of it with those name tags that are very nifty and very cool. And so we will just kind of breeze through this. It's going to be pretty dense on the slides, but we'll go through it pretty quickly and then we'll get to the kind of other stuff that we're going to be talking about today. So first of all, what exactly are pronouns? Does anyone actually want to take a stab at this one?
Descriptors? Parts of speech.
Parts of speech. All right, these are good answers. So my
names.
They are replacements for nouns.
That's the English teacher. Yep, I was just going to say that my English teacher, we're here right now, she would say, well, pronouns are substitutions for names, people, places, things, all those noun words. We're back in grammar class. But yes, they're shorthand ways to refer to people, places, things, mainly in a grammatical sense. But obviously in how we use the term pronouns today, it's kind of taken on a bit of a different meaning. They're more so ways that we express gender identity. We use them because they are aligned with our gender identity and oftentimes are very.
So I'm going to be going shortly.
Uh-oh.
I'll take
I think
this.
we need to mute.
Want to give me my cup, please?
Oh,
Land.
yeah, actually, it's gonna work on that.
And I'll be back around noon. I'll listen to a few more minutes.
They're also important for
Or
a variety
before
of
we
reasons.
go.
Especially about kind of what we talked about earlier with them being related to our gender identity. But it's also important just because we don't want to be referred to by the wrong people. If someone's like, hey, I'm a guy, I use he, him pronouns, and someone says, oh yeah, she was over there earlier. That feels wrong, and oftentimes that can be pretty insulting, especially to people whose pronouns really do matter to them. Now, the question then becomes, how do we use them properly and avoid those kind of mistakes? And believe it or not, there's actually a little bit more to this than just use the word. So the first major tip I'm going to give is to never assume someone's pronouns. We oftentimes, our brains like to go fast. They like to create shortcuts. And so when we see someone that looks like a man, we'll say, oh, he uses he, him pronouns. Problem solved, don't have to think about it at all. But that's not always the case. And so it's never a good idea to just directly assume because you don't know for sure. Instead, ask. If maybe you can hear it through context clues or hear their pronouns through another conversation that's going on about them. But if you can't, it is okay and acceptable to just ask. There are other ways though, so it's not, you don't even have to kind of get into that maybe a little bit awkward situation of asking for someone's pronouns. You can also just bring it up in everyday conversation, like how I started this presentation introducing myself with my pronouns. That creates a open space for other people to do the same. Or if you were, say, in a business meeting and someone say, hi, I am John Business Guy, I use he, him pronouns. And that creates an opportunity, a conversational space for then whoever's on the other side of that handshake to say, oh, I'm Jamie, businesswoman, and I use she, her pronouns. And that creates that open dialogue. Now, there are also cases of people who use multiple pronouns, and there's a few different ways that this can be done. It also can be a little bit confusing, so we're going to touch on this just for a little bit. One of the more common ways is when they're interchangeable. You'll sometimes see people who say, hi, my pronouns are she, her, and they, them. And usually this means that they're interchangeable, as in, if you use either one, you're going to be fine. But it can also be kind of context specific in a variety of ways. And one common way is with people who are gender fluid. And what that means is that it's a person who, they don't really stay in one gender identity for very long. They are, as the name implies, fluid. It could be where every morning they wake up and say, I'm feeling more like a man today, or I'm feeling a little bit more non-binary, or et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes then their pronouns will change as well with their gender identity, which usually is one of those situations where it's a good idea to just kind of ask and check in, maybe even each day, if this is someone that you are very close with or regularly interact with, like, hey, what pronouns are you feeling today? Easy way to start that. The other case of interchangeable pronouns is when people are out or not. Sometimes being out about our gender identity, kind of making it public, can be a dangerous thing. And so maybe based on the community that you're around, someone's pronouns could change. If you have a very close friend at school, perhaps it could be something like where, hey, I want you to use she, her pronouns with me, but when they're out at school, when there's bullies and unsupportive teachers and all sorts of things like that, they don't want to be referred to as that because that can make them a target for those undesirable actions. And it can feel kind of icky at times to not refer to a person by the pronouns that they kind of want to be referred to. But keeping people safe is definitely very important, and we want to make sure that we're respecting that and following the lead of these individuals because they're going to know their safety best. Now, it's also understandable that mistakes are going to happen. We're not perfect. We're not absolutely amazing at pronouns all the time. I still mess up pronouns now and again too, and it's okay. It's understandable to make a mistake to a degree because I don't really think there's anyone that's going to absolutely just throw a fit if you use the wrong pronouns for them once. But if you use the wrong pronouns for them every day for 3 years straight and say, oh, yep, sorry, just learning it, after 3 years or so, that starts to fall off a little bit. That excuse doesn't really carry as much weight, so to speak. And so it's okay to make mistakes, but don't make a habit of making those mistakes. And really what it comes down to with those mistakes, though, is the intent, which is often pretty visible for both the sender and the recipient, shall we say. People can kind of tell when it's a genuine mistake, or if it's intentional misgendering, or if it's a genuine mistake that's been going on for years and it just kind of says, hey, I don't really care to fix this mistake. I'm just going to keep making it. So the intent is important because it is very visible and you want to make sure that you have good intent behind your words. The best way to go about correcting a mistake is to apologize and correct yourself quickly and move on. I've seen some people who will make a mistake and then go into a big 5-minute gush about, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, I've been struggling with this, and they mean well. And it's hard to say, oh, why are you doing that? But it is distracting from the conversation. It suddenly makes that conversation about their mistake, not your pronouns or whatever the other conversation topic may be. So in general, it's better practice to just kind of apologize quickly, correct yourself, and move on. And this doesn't just apply to mistakes that you make as well. It can also apply to correcting others. Even if they're not in the room, it's still a good idea to stand up for and correct the mistakes of other people, referring to people with the wrong pronouns. And lastly, like we talked about a little earlier, we want to create that habit of introducing those pronouns ahead of time, because that can create a really good atmosphere and a really good opportunity to introduce pronouns. And actually, it's also a very good sign of support for other people who may be struggling with their gender identity or are trying out a new set of pronouns. So things like introducing at the start of the conversation, like we talked about earlier, or putting it in your email signature, putting it on, say, if you had a bunch of name tags recently and you got stickers to like put pronouns on, that'd be a pretty cool idea if you did that. I think that'd be nice. But it is that sign of support that's even more important than just the idea of getting that space, that conversational space. Let's see. All right, so that's our refresher on pronouns. I know we kind of breezed through that there, but we're going to get to some other topics now, and you guys already seem pretty well educated on the pronoun front. So we're going to start talking about identity and expression. And this section is mainly going to be about exploring some common terminology, because there are a lot of new terms that are being used as this area of human understanding is becoming more and more publicly known. And some of the terms can be a bit confusing. There are a lot of common misconceptions, a lot of common points of confusion. And so we're going to explore a few different terms and kind of pick them apart and just make sure that we've got some good, solid understandings with them. So with that in mind, we're first going to do a bit of a comparison here between the two terms of biological sex and gender. Now, does someone in the audience want to be very brave and take a stab at answering what the difference is between these two?
I will sit out.
I know answers to them but one is, I would say one in general is more physical, the other is more sense of self. It's more inner sense of self.
That's a very good way to put it. I wish you had written this slide, because that's honestly probably better than what I have here. But you're exactly right. Biological sex is a lot more concerned with physical characteristics. It's stuff that's assigned at birth. When they look at an ultrasound, they're like, oh, well, it's a guy. We can tell from looking at the body. And in an ideal world, we would ask the baby its gender and be like, hey, hi, you just were born 5 minutes ago. What's your gender identity and what are your pronouns? It'd be nice if we could do that, but there's a few barriers to that maybe make that a little bit more difficult. So instead, we rely on that biological sex. In medical environments as well, we also want to refer to that, because that can have some physiological differences depending on what's being done and who we're working with, but more on that later. When we're talking about biological sex, though, the main terms that we're using are things like male, female, intersex, others as well. And these are kind of clear indications of this is their sex we're talking about, not their gender. Because gender, on the other hand, isn't more concerned with those physical characteristics. It's more concerned with internal experience and outward expression. It is, like you said, it is a sense of self. It's more kind of mental. And this is defined by each individual, but it's also shaped by society. Society kind of has some ideas of what certain genders should look like and act. And these are just guidelines, and they're not rules. You do not have to follow them in the slightest, but they do kind of guide some of our gender roles in our more common areas. And so there is that interplay between both the individual definition and the societal definition that comes into the picture of an individual. Now, when we're talking about gender, we're not using terms like male or female, we're using terms like man, woman, or non-binary, or others. And I know those terms sound pretty similar, but it's important to make that distinction of the more clinical, biological, male, female, versus the more gender, emotional, mental, man, woman, non-binary, etc. So for our next comparison, we are going to go with sexual identity and gender identity. This is one that I get a lot, people asking like, okay, aren't they the same thing? And the answer is no. So who would like to tell me why they're not the same thing? You can if you want,
That'll be fine.
unless someone else wants to raise their hand.
Sexual identity is, I teach owls.
It's okay.
So, I mean, I really should do better at this, but words are hard, it's early in the morning. Gender identity is who you identify as internally. Sexual identity is more who you like.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So sexual identity refers to what genders you are attracted to. And it is kind of in relation to your own gender identity is how we use these terms, but it's not the same. And that's where that confusion, I think, comes in. So when we're talking about sexual identity, we're using terms like heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, or others. And these refer to, again, those gender identities that you're attracted to in the relation of your own. So when someone's bisexual, that means that they are attracted to both people of the same gender as theirs and people of different genders. If you are homosexual, it's just that you're attracted to people of the same gender. And so it's all about referring to your identity and then what you are attracted to in relation to that. On the other side, then, your gender identity is just more specifically what gender or genders you are yourself. And all sorts of factors contribute to this, like the pronouns we talked about earlier, but also your body shape, clothes, all sorts of other things. And these are not hard determinants. It's not that these will absolutely determine your gender identity, but again, kind of touching on that societal interplay, these are what we more commonly associate with specific genders. And so most people that are of a specific gender will align in some ways and not align in other ways to that more societal idea of it. When we're talking about gender identity, then we use terms more like man, woman, or non-binary. And we also have these two terms of cisgender and transgender. And we're going to get to these in, actually, let's get to them right now. For our last comparison, let's compare the two, cisgender and transgender. Someone else want to take a crack at this one?
Well, cisgender is you were born probably with female genitalia, raised as a female, and identify as a female.
Okay, yeah, that's a good example of it. That's actually a pretty good one.
But transgender would be all those things, born female physically, but really identify in your soul as a male.
Mhm.
And may have physical changes to complete that process.
Yeah,
Or may not.
that's a great definition. Talks about both just kind of the source of it and what you can expect with people like that.
I feel compelled to add a little bit if I may.
Mhm.
Please.
The reason I love this so much is, to the best of my knowledge, this is the only time a term from organic chemistry has made it into common lexicon.
Yes, it has.
And I love that. I'm a chemist, or I was. Even better, the reason the cisgender is a great descriptor word is it means the opposite of trans is not blank, it's not normal. The opposite of trans is cis.
Yes.
There's two different descriptors equal that show opposites. And it is much less pathologizing.
Mhm. That's a very, very good point. That
That's
actually,
what I love about it.
you are reading ahead a little bit because I was going to cover that in the slides, but you have beat me to it. Very well done. But yes, cisgender is when your current gender identity aligns with the assigned sex you were at birth. People talk about being assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth because of, again, those primary sexual characteristics, and doctors say, oh, well, it's a boy. But again, you can't really ask the baby what their gender is. And so we go with that assigned sex at birth, but then people either stay with that for their gender identity and are cis, or they change it and are trans. And so yes, we use cis and trans commonly to abbreviate cisgender and transgender. As we also touched on, it's got a bit of those Latin prefixes in there, because cis literally means on the same side. And so you're on the same side as the gender you started out as, more or less. And then of course, transgender on, well, literally on the different side. But this is not exclusively along that gender binary. There are people who do transition from male to female or female to male, but there are also people who transition from male to non-binary, and they're still trans. All right, so we have a good idea of some good terminology. So now we're going to talk kind of more about, with these ideas in place, some of the big problems that youth today in the LGBT plus community, specifically trans youth, are facing, and how you can help, whether you yourself identify as trans or as an ally. So to start out, we're going to talk about dysphoria. Dysphoria is a pretty big problem that relates to a lot of other problems we're going to cover later on in this section. So let's get this one started out quickly. The problems are mainly that, as a definition, it is this negative feeling of mismatch between your appearance and your desired image. So if you identify as a man, but you feel like you have a more feminine appearance, that can cause dysphoria because you're not looking like how you are supposed to look. And it's a pretty unpleasant feeling. And this is where a lot of those gender lines and those gender roles come in. But it's also important to know that it is not necessary to be trans. You don't have to have dysphoria to be trans, mainly because cis people can experience it too. Say if you had long hair, or like, you know what, that's a sign of my femininity. That's what makes me feel like a woman, is I have these long flowing locks. And then you get diagnosed with cancer and you get through it, but unfortunately with the chemotherapy, you lose all that really nice hair. If you feel like less of a woman because of that, because you associated your hair with womanhood and now you've lost it, that is dysphoria. That unpleasant feeling is dysphoria. But you're not trans, you're still a woman, you were born a woman and you still identify as a woman. And so it's important to note that dysphoria is not necessary to be trans, and you don't need to be trans to have dysphoria. Both sides of that are at play. And as we touched on, it's related to a lot of other issues because it is a very broad, encompassing negative effect that a lot of trans and cis individuals face. But we'll get to more of those in a bit. So, how do we help? The best thing that you can do to someone who's experiencing dysphoria is to just be supportive, be affirming to them. Sometimes our brains like to play tricks on us, and they make parts of our body that we don't like stand out even more than they actually are. And that can lead to a pretty negative self-image in people. So being supportive and affirming and challenging those negative assumptions can be helpful, but it's also important to not be unrealistic. Someone says they feel really dysphoric because they identify as a woman yet have a beard that reaches down to their belly button, and that's causing them dysphoria. You don't want to say, oh no, I don't notice that. I could barely see it, because it's pretty obvious. Instead, offer support by checking in with them, seeing how they're doing, and offering ways to solve those problems. Finding those solutions, maybe if it's that beard situation, finding a good barber. These solutions to solving dysphoria can be both material and medical. Anything from makeup to clothes to even like surgeries or hormone treatments can all be used to combat dysphoria. But the bottom line with dysphoria is that it's also a very subjective thing. What causes dysphoria for one individual may not cause dysphoria for another. It's not that every single trans woman feels dysphoria about their hair or some other thing. it varies from person to person what does and does not cause those feelings of dysphoria. So it's helpful to kind of take that individual approach as well with those support and affirmations. The next topic we're going to touch on is misgendering, dead naming. This is where a lot about that education about pronouns that you guys already have is going to come into play. So the main problems with misgendering and dead naming are honestly pretty self-explanatory. Misgendering is when you incorrectly identify someone's gender. This is often in the form of using pronouns incorrectly. Dead naming, though, is a term that is a bit unfamiliar for people who aren't kind of in this community. When people transition, they usually will also change their names. And this is, again, touching on that idea of dysphoria. If you identify as a woman but have a very masculine sounding name, that name could cause some dysphoria. And so people will often change their names. Their old name then is usually in these communities referred to as their dead name. And you usually don't want to use it. It's a pretty kind of grim term because it's something that's appropriately, I don't want to say taboo, but it's something that you don't want to use. You don't want to refer to someone by a name that they're not using. And this again can be accidental or it can be intentional. And the difference is usually pretty noticeable. If someone accidentally calls you by the wrong name because they've known you for 10 years and this is a very new development, that's an easy accident to make, and that's usually understandable to a degree. But if they've been calling you the wrong name for 10 years, that's when that kind of falls apart again. And this is where we can touch on those names and pronouns. I'm sorry, I don't have my notes with me right now.
Yeah.
But this also applies to the names as well. Thank you. There are even more subjects with ideas of misgendering and dead naming. There are other places that can come up with that. Yeah?
Something that I really feel needs to be brought out here is dead naming is weaponized.
Yes.
And that is, it's the one thing that will instantaneously rouse my anger. And it's why my mother and I don't have a relationship.
And that's a very good
She
example.
refuses to recognize my name that I have had now for over 20 years. I cannot stress enough that dead naming is an actual attack on a person. Yes, sometimes it's accidental, and yes, we can always tell the intent. I'm willing to say always. And after the second or third time, if they're just not trying or they're doing it deliberately, you cut them out of your life, period. They're not worth your time.
Yeah.
I can't stress it strong enough.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. And that's a very good point to make, that yes, it does. People feel very strongly about this. Most people do. That's not, your opinion is not an uncommon opinion in this subject, I assure you. And so using those wrong names is a pretty significant thing. And you really don't have too many mistakes to make with that before people are going to start to get a bit annoyed with you. And again, like you touched on, oftentimes this is weaponized. People know that using the wrong name makes trans people upset, and they like to make trans people upset, so they continue to do that. And that's just mean and rude and a lot of other words that I probably shouldn't say in a church. So
It's okay, we're
you
progressive.
use your imaginations. But there are ways to help. Again, this comes back to correcting those mistakes, both in yourself and with others, even when the person that's being dead named or misgendered isn't around. Still stick up for them. They'll be thankful for it. It's also, again, a good idea to normalize that proper pronoun usage like we talked about earlier, putting those pronouns in your name, on your name tags, in signature lines of an email, all sorts of things like that. And another good idea is just practice, because sometimes we do make mistakes. If you've been known by one name and one set of pronouns for all of your life, and then you change it, good for you, that's great. People might need a little bit of time to adjust as well. And one of the ways that you can help speed that process along is by practicing. If you have a recently trans person in your life, practice their new names. I had a friend once who, every time they made a mistake misgendering someone or using their wrong name, they would literally like just remove themselves from the conversation and say 5 sentences with that person's correct name and correct pronouns, and then just hop back into the conversation. And that practice really does help. It does speed that process of getting used to that new name along. And lastly, as is the case for most of these situations, you want to follow the lead of the individual in question. Again, sometimes coming out with a new name or new pronouns can be unsafe in certain scenarios, and so you just want to follow what they're doing and what they think is best. The next topic we're going to talk about are some pretty big ones, medicine and legislation. I kind of grouped these together, even though honestly they could be split apart. We could probably even have a whole conversation just about medicine with transgender individuals here, but maybe another time if I come back again. There's a lot of fascinating work to be talked about with that. But the main problems are that these, again, are very big issues. And there's a lot of medical encounters on the medicine side where you have incorrect names, pronouns, and gender markers both being said by the medical professional or also on their charts, their sheets. And there is some inevitability with this. Like we talked about earlier, sometimes you need to refer to someone's biological sex because you're treating something that is specific to that. And if you use the wrong medication or the wrong dosage, it could really screw things up. But it's not always necessary. If you're going in for a dental checkup or you're going in to heal a broken knee, like you don't need to talk about your biological sex there. And so doctors should be using your correct name and pronouns and gender identity. Yeah.
I have a very pertinent example, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
The worst I ever experienced was I presented at an ER with respiratory distress. I could not breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And my partner at the time was with me, and they were asking what medications I was on. And when they got to estradiol, they asked, well, why are you on that? And I was able to, over gasps, explain, why. And it immediately turned from assessing my respiratory condition to a psych consult to make sure I wasn't fucking suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
And I have never gotten over that. So I tend to be extremely careful about what doctors and professionals I choose.
Mm-hmm.
I screen them aggressively.
And the big thing with, especially with stories like that, is that oftentimes these misgendering and dead naming in the medical profession is due to providers' lack of training on the subject. This is a newer area. Now, trans people are not new. Trans people have been around for as long as gender itself has been around. The reason why transness and gender identity and all this stuff is becoming so much more popular nowadays is because thankfully we're entering an environment where it's more accepting to explore your gender identity and present in different ways. We've come a long way since several hundreds of years ago where people that were transgender often had a lot of systemic violence acted upon them. Unfortunately, though, there's also still a long ways to go. And that's where we kind of come into this idea of anti-trans legislation. Oftentimes when I say this, people think about bathroom bills, as they're called, and what bathrooms you're supposed to use. And again, this is something that we could talk about for a very long time and have some very good discussion about, but to keep things moving along, we'll just touch on that these things are out there and they're very problematic. Oftentimes they're coming from either a lack of training and education on the subject, or more often from a place of prejudice and bigotry. And it's easy to think that these are situations where it's like, oh, they happen down in some of those deep South states or other parts of the world, but we're here in Minnesota. Minnesota's a fairly liberal state. We don't have to worry about that stuff. That stuff's not happening here. But it's closer to home than you might think. There was actually a case only a few years ago in Virginia, Minnesota, just an hour north of here, where there was an issue with the school board. Someone was using the bathroom that matched their gender identity, but not their biological sex. And it turned very ugly very quickly. There were national groups taking out full-page ads in the Mesabi Tribune of just these very hateful things and trying to fearmonger, and it was very bad. Thankfully, though, it got resolved well. The school board made some good choices, and situation has thankfully gone behind them. Unfortunately, a very similar situation is also happening in Duluth Public Schools right about now, and within about a month or so, I think the school board is going to be voting on a similar situation that's been happening. And so it's easy to pretend that these these conflicts are far away. They're in other parts of the world. We don't have to worry about them here, but we still do. And so how do we support? How do we help out?
I want to add on that it's not being talked about in the media very long, but Trump, we all know, is trying to run again, and he did put a speech out there directly delineating what he plans to do against transgender people, federally. So no, it is coming home. It is a repeat of 1930s, and we need to be vigilant. We can't just say, oh, it happens elsewhere, because the governors that are doing this in their states and the legislation, they're just gearing up for more later.
Mhm. Like I said, we've made some great strides in recent history in the rights of trans individuals, but there's still a lot of pushback. There's still a lot of distance to go before true equality and true equity is achieved. And there are a lot of agencies on local, state, and federal levels that are actively trying to set back this progress. These are big issues. Advocacy and support help. It's a good idea to get involved, but these are difficult things. No one's expecting you and you alone to be this champion for trans rights and single-handedly dismantle every single anti-trans bill currently in the country. No one's expecting you to do that. You can all breathe a sigh of relief if you'd like. But instead, getting that support, being there for the trans individuals in your life, but also getting involved in advocacy groups, getting involved in that political sphere to the best of your physical and mental capabilities, because it is very stressful at times, but your voice can be heard and it can make a difference. If one person is saying, hey, these bathroom bills are just excuses to prejudice and just reasons that people are going to try and oppress trans individuals, there's one voice saying that, people aren't going to hear it very well. But if there's a million voices saying that, that message is going to get a lot farther and a lot louder. Another good idea is to educate yourself. Educate yourself on these issues, both on an individual level and on these systemic ideas of the violence and oppression that trans individuals face. Now, the important distinction I want to make here is that I'm saying educate yourself. It should not always be other people's responsibility. And this is something that can sometimes be misconstrued, because it isn't trans people's responsibility to educate you, but it's something that we can do, and it's okay. It's just, we shouldn't be the sole bearer of that responsibility. Instead, there are plenty of other opportunities where you can also educate yourself without placing that burden of education on other people. You can seek out educational resources like the plentiful ones online. Just make sure you practice all of that critical reading and fact-checking stuff that we've become very accustomed with in the modern day and age. There are other books and movies. Sometimes it's a good idea to just get a more individual perspective rather than statistics and facts. And lastly, presentations and community outreach are great opportunities to learn more about these topics. If you were curious about transness and the LGBT community as a whole, and like your church or something was putting together a presentation with a guest speaker that you could attend on the subject, that'd be pretty cool. I think that'd be pretty cool if you attended that. Lastly, we are going to touch on mental health. And this, again, can be a little bit triggering for some people, so please exercise what feels best for you, because these are also very big, very heavy problems. A lot of that dysphoria from earlier comes into this. It causes a lot of deteriorated mental health. The LGBTQ+ community faces higher levels of depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders compared to very many other communities. And this is a lot because of that the oppression and discrimination like we talked about earlier. In the transgender community specifically, I mean, I believe this is, sorry, again, I don't have my notes in front of me at the moment, but I believe that the statistics also show that in the last year alone, over 50%, that is over half of trans individuals, trans youth that were surveyed last year had reported thinking about suicide, and several of them had attempted as well. I mean, that's over half. That is a huge, huge number. And there's this systemic individual levels of oppression and discrimination. It can be from your governor passing anti-trans legislation, or it can just be from an individual, like a parent or former friend who is refusing to use their correct name and pronouns. These can all have a very pronounced negative impact on someone's mental health. But you can't help. Providing support is single-handedly the most important thing you can do to help combat these mental health issues. With all of those statistics, it can be kind of easy to get into a very grim mindset of, wow, there's so much of this oppression and so much thoughts of suicide because of it. But the important statistic that I absolutely love is that of those people experiencing those thoughts of suicide, those thoughts go down by over 40% in the presence of just one supportive individual regularly in your life. That is enormous, and that is a huge underscore for just how important that support for people can be. It can literally be life-saving. And support doesn't always mean, though, those big, heavy emotional conversations. Sometimes it's the light stuff too. Constantly talking about how I'm feeling today because if I'm feeling suicidal or XYZ, like that can get very heavy and very exhausting. Sometimes I just want to sit and grab a pint of Ben and Jerry's and play video games. Doing that with someone, that's support too. And that's sometimes just as important, if not more important. A great way to do this is to stand up for others. Also, again, when they're not around. If someone's being misgendered or dead named when they're not around, still stick up for them because they will hear about it most likely eventually, and that can also have a very negative effect on someone's mood. And lastly, then you want to follow their lead. This can be in the form of things like check-ins, where say, hey, how are you feeling today emotionally? And if they're feeling good, then they're feeling good. If they're not, and you can shift that conversation to how can I help you out then? Do you need someone to talk to about these really heavy things? Do you need someone to just go with you to the coffee shop and share a nice cup of coffee with? It's all about what they need. And really this kind of comes back to the most important thing in all of this, I really think, which is trust. The bottom line is nobody knows what's going to be best for them with 100% certainty. We don't know. We don't have a crystal ball in which we can see the future and say, yes, this decision is going to absolutely be the best for me. Nice, but alas, we do not have that. But the people who have the best idea, the people who are most likely to know, are the individuals themselves. And so trusting trans individuals when they say, hey, this is how I'm feeling, these are the procedures I want to go through, these are the things I want to do, trusting that they're making the most informed decision about their bodies and about their minds and about their lives is crucial. It's okay to have questions and concerns and say, hey, have you thought about this? Oh, what about this option? But at the end of the day, a little bit of trust for the trans people in your lives goes a very, very long way. And I cannot stress that enough.